So, I'm someone with a minor obsession with werewolves, as I've mentioned before on this channel, and romance is by far my favorite genre. So, would it surprise you to learn that I'm not actually a big fan of werewolf romance? And part of that is just a matter of preference. I like scary werewolves way more than I like sexy werewolves. Not that I'm opposed on principle to the idea of werewolf love interest, mind you. Wolves, and by extension werewolves, have a long history of symbolizing sex and sexuality, a topic I don't have time to go into right now, but I'll definitely touch on later when I do a deep dive into the story of Little Red Riding Hood. The biggest reason by far that I don't care for werewolf romance is that it more often than not includes a number of tropes that at best I don't care for, and at worst actively gross me out. And I don't think there's any better example of the latter than the alpha trope, and today I want to explain why. Quick little side note before we begin, I am aware of the existence of the Omegaverse and its crossover with shifter romances, but I haven't read any of those books specifically, and quite frankly, I don't really have any desire to, so I can't say how much of what I'm going to say here applies to books taking place in that universe. This is specifically in regard to the werewolf and/or shifter romances I've read, and some problematic patterns that have emerged. Okay, moving on. When you see this trope, the alpha werewolf is generally the head of a pack, usually male, although not always, and maintains that position with a domineering personality and often the threat of physical violence, if not violence itself. Now, there are a number of reasons I don't like this trope. The first one is a pretty simple one. It perpetuates the myth of real wolves having a similar social hierarchy. This whole trope originates from the idea that wolf packs are governed by alpha wolves, who assert themselves over their more submissive counterparts through violent competition. This idea was first introduced in 1970 through a book called The Wolf, Ecology and Behavior of an Endangered Species, by a man called David Meach, and it presented the notion that wolf packs functioned with alpha wolves on top, betas and gammas in the middle, and omegas down at the bottom. Unfortunately, though, there was a big problem with this research because the studies conducted only observed wolves in captivity, and that's essentially like trying to study human behavior by only observing people in prison. Of course, you're going to come to some wrong conclusions. And to his credit, David Meach did eventually realize this through studying wolves in their natural habitats, and rejected his original notion of alphas in a paper released in 1999. In reality, wolf packs are made up of family units, led by a breeding pair, who are the mother and father of the rest of the pack. So while they do hold authority over their pups, it's no more than the average parent has over their children, and no one I know goes around calling their parents the alphas. If you do, then please invite me over for dinner because I'm really curious about your family dynamics. Unfortunately, by the time Meach put the truth out there, the myth of alpha wolves had already taken root in our culture and is still being perpetuated today. So seeing the same idea presented in our fiction only serves to reinforce the myth. But I know what you're going to say. Werewolves are fictional creatures and don't have to be governed by the same structures that make up real-life wolf packs. And you know what? I agree. They absolutely don't. And werewolves are also part human, so it makes sense that they would take influence from more human social structures and appoint one leader to each pack. But let's talk about that too, because if you went by the alpha trope, you would start to believe that leadership and domination are the same thing, and they absolutely are not. Most of the time, these werewolf alphas have acquired their position by dethroning the old alpha in a physical competition, and fends off other rivals in a similar manner.
Yes, Alpha! Alpha? I am not Alpha, he is... Oh!
And once the alpha has secured their position, the way they govern their pack isn't much better. In some fiction, such as the Twilight novels, it's literally impossible for the wolves in the pack to stand up to their alpha, and they're forced to obey them no matter what. And while the idea of a violent and dangerous leader who can literally override his subordinates' free will would be a great concept in a horror novel, it's not something I want to see held up as some kind of ideal. In other works, it is possible to go against an alpha's command, but the consequences of doing so would range from severe punishment to exile and even death. In other words, it's incredibly rare for an alpha to rule through methods that are not fear, threats, and physical domination. But the truth is, true leaders aren't just out for power, they're out to get the job done. And sure, sometimes that does mean stepping on some toes. But more often than not, it means listening to input from others and accepting criticism when it's leveled at them. And I don't like that the alpha wolf trope paints a leader as someone who can simply kick the most ass in the room. That's not what it's about. And sometimes the alpha's dominance goes beyond just the physical and all the way into genetics with a whole alpha bloodline. Now, sometimes what that means is just a simple monarchy, where the role is passed down from parent to child. Nothing too troubling there. The fantasy genre is full of monarchies, and while I think most of us realize that's not the ideal form of government in the real world, it's still fun to read about, and people are born into families and circumstances outside of their control every single day. But some authors take it even further and make it so that these werewolves have some sort of inherent genetic superiority that makes them alphas. Which brings us into the realm of magical eugenics, another concept that is scarily common in werewolf fiction, especially when coupled with the idea of fated mates, or as it's called in Twilight, imprinting, where the werewolves have no say in who they fall for and their ideal match is already chosen for them by the universe. I could do a whole video on the idea of soulmates or fated mates by itself, so let me know if that's something you want to see in the future. But for now, let's just say that it's not my favorite trope. But these aren't the only problems with the alpha trope. As I mentioned before, the alphas you see in fiction are almost always male, meaning this trope has more than a few misogynistic undertones, if not blatant themes. And sometimes this is freely acknowledged by the author, but simply acknowledging something is not the same as challenging or critiquing it, which these works rarely ever do. Many right-wing men have begun referring to themselves as alpha males, and no, that's not a furry thing, but go ahead and ask them if it is next time they say this. They'll love that. These are men who center their entire identity around the idea that they are inherently superior to other men, which is usually based off of their ability, whether real or imagined, to sleep with women, even if that means not respecting their consent or boundaries. And unfortunately, some of these attitudes do carry over into werewolf fiction, primarily in romance, where the alpha will assert himself over not just his rivals, but his love interest as well. And I do recognize that at least some of this probably comes from kinks that either the author, the readers, or both happen to have. Some people really like being bossed around, and while I don't judge that, I'll also never understand it. I'm a pretty stubborn person to the point where if someone tells me to do something that I was already going to do without prompting, suddenly I don't want to do it anymore.
Have a good day.
Don't tell me what to do.
I'm not trying to paint myself as some ideal here. I know that's not always a good thing, but it is the way I'm wired. I also don't really like bossing around other people. In general, I operate on the assumption that everyone knows their own life much better than I do, and therefore can run it better than I could. And even if I could run it better, I wouldn't want to. I have my own crap to deal with. You take care of yours.
This will be a good time for him to learn self-reliance.
But like I said, I don't judge what other people are into. And if this whole alpha dominance thing was just a kinky BDSM type of relationship, then it honestly wouldn't bother me. But this dominance is rarely ever restricted to the bedroom in these types of stories, with the alpha being overly controlling or demanding in other aspects of his love interest's life, which is no way to conduct a relationship. Even BDSM is built on mutual respect, conversations, and boundaries. Even my asexual ass knows that. Now, not everyone who writes an alpha werewolf is a right-winger or an anti-feminist. Some of them are feminists, and many of them, to their credit, do try and sanitize this trope as much as they can. But that doesn't mean they don't still run into problems. As an example, I read a shifter romance a couple years back called True Nature by author J, and this story avoids many of the problems that come along with this trope. First of all, it's a lesbian romance, so it's not as though we have a female character constantly submitting to the man in her life, and there is a healthy respect and understanding that's built between the two female leads. But the alpha woman of this story still embodies many of the same personality traits as the males from other books, being forceful and emotionally reserved. And all of this just serves to reinforce traditionally masculine standards of strength and weakness. Look, just to be clear, there is nothing wrong with a woman sharing more traditionally masculine traits if that's part of who she is. I was a tomboy for a big chunk of my life, and still am in some respects. But if you went by what you see and read in media, you would think that every woman in a position of power has to be a man with boobs in order to maintain her authority. And to be fair, there is pressure in the real world for ambitious women to present themselves that way, because our society still largely views femininity as weak. So for the love of God, let's change that and start portraying female leaders as both feminine and strong. And I would point to examples like Sansa Stark from Game of Thrones or Cora Crawley from Downton Abbey as examples of how to do this well. Yes, as women in positions of authority, they are required to take control and lay down the law sometimes, but they do this without sacrificing their femininity, and prove that you don't need to be aggressive or cold-hearted in order to command respect. And as for the male leaders we write, please, let's do away with this whole notion of might makes right. I take no issues with characters of any gender being able to kick some ass. In fact, I love to see it. But let's stop pretending that that's all it takes to be a good leader. Look at somebody like Aragorn from Lord of the Rings. Yes, he can swing a sword if he needs to, but that's not why people follow him. They follow him because he's intelligent, a man of his word, and he shows compassion to those under his command. If this is how these alphas were portrayed, not as dominant, aggressive rulers, but as simple protectors and providers, then I wouldn't have the issue with this trope that I do. And I'm sure there are a handful of stories that have portrayed alphas as such. After all, almost any trope can be done well in the hands of the right author. But it's rare enough that I still haven't come across any of these stories, and I've been reading werewolf fiction since I was a preteen. So, as it stands, the alpha trope really grosses me out, and I'm more than a little apprehensive about picking up any book that includes it. But what do you think about this trope? Do you dislike it as much as I do, or do you think I'm totally off base? Have I ruined something you love with feminism? If that's the case, then I'm sorry, but I also can't promise I won't do it again. Whatever the case may be, tell me in the comments down below. If you enjoyed this video, be sure and leave it a like, and subscribe to my channel for more. Until next time, stay brilliant everybody, and I'll see you in the next one.